All right, welcome back to the Ascendible Church podcast. It's Pastor Mitch here with Pastor John.
What's up?
Hey, this week we are going to be diving into the text, Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 17.
Yeah.
This is the one that if you actually watched the entire sermon online, which we didn't tell anybody this anywhere other than in our church like text thread, but the sermon ends because our camera accidentally shut off. So for the first time, we're going to cover some content that you would have heard if you were there on Sunday.
Yeah.
But you couldn't hear online, and now you'll hear here in the podcast. So, yeah, John, will you read the text, and we can just dive in from there?
Mark chapter 2, verse 13. He went out beside the sea, and all the crowds were coming to him, and he was teaching them. And he passed by, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at his tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need for a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners."
Awesome. Sweet. So I think here's what we'll do today. Let's go like through the text verse by verse.
Yep.
And then let's kind of zoom through and let's get to the end, because that's honestly where the really good application is. So if you listen to the sermon online, you've hit, kind of the setup for the ending. And so, yeah, John, what's happening?
Yeah. So Jesus is again traveling, says he's beside the sea, and he's teaching.
Yeah. By boat.
Where do you get that, by the way? Just curious.
Where do I get that?
It's just because in the ESV that we're reading here, it just says he's beside the sea.
Yeah. I mean, again, the idea of the tax collector going from town to town would imply that they're almost going like through a boat dock.
Gotcha.
So that's
like through a toll booth.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So he's by boat and he's teaching, which we've seen before. Like every time we're seeing Jesus do things, he's here to preach. So he's teaching them, and he sees this tax collector named Levi.
Yeah.
And just says, "Follow me."
Yep.
So, and then
it's not a question.
Immediately gets up and leaves.
Yep. Yeah. Which again, it's Luke's text, I believe, that records. It says that he arose and he left everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're right with that. Yeah.
Yep. And so who's Levi?
So Levi is also known as Matthew. So he would have been the one that wrote the Gospel of Matthew. But he's one of the 12. And the way I've been talking about it is we got to think about this guy. He's a good Jewish kid.
Yeah.
Who at some point left it and said, "That's not for me," because that's what you had to do to go and be a tax collector for the Roman Empire. Right.
Yeah.
So at some point he has walked away from what he was taught is truth.
Yeah, to chase worldly riches.
To chase worldly riches, yeah. And so then, then I'm assuming he's in somewhere around Capernaum, which is where we talk Jesus is, knows who Jesus is, but has never had an interaction with him that we have recorded.
Yeah.
And Jesus just, it seems like out of the blue, just looks at him and says, "Follow me."
Yeah, the text reads in a way that it's like Jesus actually sees into his soul and his need to follow him. And so Jesus says the very thing that, is going to grasp his heart and says, "Follow him." Okay, John, earlier last week, I asked you, I reached out, and we didn't get to talk about it a ton in the sermon yesterday, but I asked John, as I do sometimes when I'm like, "Hey, I'm about to be stuck on something." I'm like, "Can you help me?" So I asked John, I said, why is his name, like, why Levi? Why do we assume it's Matthew? And so will you just dig into that a little? There's not, first off, let me set it up that like, there's not a ton out there on why does this text record Matthew's name to be Levi?
Right.
Like we were talking about, it's actually kind of shocking how few commentaries address
none of them.
Address this. But what did you find when you're digging last week?
Essentially, he has two names.
Yeah.
Both of them are Jewish names, which is not odd, is what most of the commentators say. They're like, he just had two names and you can use either one interchangeably. And I don't know how that works, but because I mean, we have a first name and middle name.
Yeah.
Is it like that? I don't know. But
yeah, and so you want to go to like, is he a Levite? Is that all these
right.
questions? And it's like, to be honest, it's like there's not a lot of clarity and answers there. It just simply seems like his name was Levi, and then later he's referred to as Matthew.
Right.
Which again, Matthew would imply in some sense this heart transformation, being like a follower of the Lord. Let's talk a little bit for a minute just about, the significance of him being a tax collector.
Yeah. So, I mean, just following along with the narrative, Jesus is calling all of these people that are on the fringes of society.
Mm-hmm.
It started with the leper, and then the paralytic, and now a tax collector. So a tax collector would have been somebody who is hated and despised. And we talked like in the Talmud, they're saying they're not even allowed to come into the synagogue. You're allowed to lie to these people.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Like, think of a legal document like saying like you're allowed to lie to someone else.
So I mean, that's like our pastors saying you're allowed to go lie to the IRS.
Yeah,
like that's essentially what
we've
saying.
Not said that.
We have not said that. I'm just saying like that's the level that this is. And so a tax collector would have been somebody who is truly hated, not allowed in the Jewish community, not allowed anywhere in the Jewish society.
Yeah. And I think we need to understand that like in its fullness, because I think we get the idea of tax collector and we're like, well, nobody likes to pay taxes.
Right.
And so like there's already this distaste, but it would be so much greater.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
because they assume that this guy has basically committed treason against his people.
Yeah.
And to a sense, like he has sold his soul to go and work for the enemy. Mm-hmm. And that's the way they view him, is that somebody who is a traitor, who has given up their way of life to go and work for the enemy in pursuit of those earthly riches.
Yeah, you keep saying about. They assume. Who's the they?
I was talking about the Jewish people.
No, I agree. Yeah. Well, in the scribes.
Yeah, the scribes, the Pharisees, just Jews in general in this society, they would not have accepted a tax collector.
Yeah.
And so like, I mean, I think we're all familiar with The Chosen by now. Like you look at that, you've got 4 disciples at this point that Mark has recorded who are people who are doing their best to follow the law, just like, but then Jesus brings this outsider in, and not just an outsider, but a traitor who they absolutely hate. And so like, that I don't know how to like emphasize it any more strongly than that.
No,
they would hate this person.
Yeah.
And yet now we see Jesus calling him in to follow. And not only that, they go to his house and share a meal, which is a way in that culture showing a very deep fellowship with this person now. So I would imagine that would have been fairly difficult for these disciples.
Which I think is a good reminder and even kind of a warning for us, again, that we addressed this a little bit in the sermon yesterday, which again was birthed off of a conversation you and I had, which is we want to so often look at the scribes and go like, oh, like, look at these judgmental people that just can't see Jesus right in front of them.
Right.
And it's like, well, imagine that the Son of God comes back and starts calling people to follow him, eventually people that he'll send out on mission. Keep in mind, Matthew, who actually is one of the people who records one of the gospel accounts, is who we're talking about.
Yeah.
And imagine that that person that he calls is someone that we see to be so far away from God. It's like I said yesterday, it's similar to, when we read accounts, which I was reading them again yesterday afternoon, of, Jeffrey Dahmer, coming to the Lord late in prison. And you're like, how is that possible?
Right.
I just can't even fathom that. And it's like, but again, if we can't fathom that the gospel can reach the people that are the farthest from God, then we're missing the point of the gospel.
And I'm not trying to steal your thunder, but like, that means no one is too far gone.
Yeah.
Like Matthew, Levi in this text, he literally walked away, was in it, and walked away.
Yeah.
And yet that's who Jesus calls.
Yeah,
to
no,
come.
you're not stealing my thunder. I'll be honest. So sometimes when I'm writing sermons, I'll take like a different approach. We've talked about this, how like there's so many great preaching styles out there. And so I find myself sometimes like I don't want to just like adopt one.
Right.
And so I'll write sermons in different stylistic manners. And I made a decision this week that I wanted to write the sermon main idea in a way that actually just flowed with the text.
Yeah.
I think if you were to ask me, like, what is the main point of the text, it would be what you just said.
Yeah.
That there is no one that's too far gone for Jesus to be able to reach. That Jesus is here to rescue the outcast. Now, that's not what we made the big idea. In essence, we made the big idea. Remind me what it was, even though I just preached it.
Yeah, it was Jesus extends an invitation, which leads to a celebration that brings clarity to his mission.
Yeah, so Jesus calls Matthew. Then we see this celebration scene.
Yep.
So after he calls Matthew, they go into this house, they dine together. What Mark's text says is they reclined at the table. And it says not only is he there, it said there's more tax collectors there specifically. And then it said, just to hammer it one more time, and sinners.
Right.
Like, this is the party. And and if we want to make it one of those scenes, like, where, even Jesus ate with the sinners, it's like, that's one thing. But then the following line of that text says that many there were many who followed him. So these are people who have responded to the same call that Matthew did, that now dined with Jesus. It's not just that Jesus is sitting with sinners. He's actually sitting with people who are now followers of God.
Right.
So like I said on Sunday, it's like if you looked at it like a snow globe and we were watching this scene, from one sense, we'd look at it and go, oh, like Jesus is eating with all these people who are unclean, but he's actually eating with people who are now righteous.
Right. Yeah. Matthew leaving his tax booth is a picture of repentance.
Yeah.
Like, we've talked before about what repentance is. And like, I even had a kid and students a couple weeks ago, like, demonstrate this. I said, all right, now walk over here.
Yeah.
Now turn around. Like, that's the picture that we see of repentance. He's walking one way. Jesus calls him and he says, I no longer can walk this way, and turns around and walks the other way.
Yeah.
Like, that's what Matthew is doing.
Which I think is cool, because in our modern world, now this text speaks to two different groups of people. It speaks to those people that think they're too far for God to be able to reach. So that's like the first category, and it's just the fact he's a tax collector, which is like considered to be some of the worst in ancient society, and yet God is inviting that person in. That's one side. But now it's also another example of someone who leaves worldly riches to follow Jesus, and there he finds peace and finds mission for his entire life.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those texts where it's like yesterday, it's like it hits every single heart in the room.
Yeah.
Because you're like, everyone can understand how important and timely that is for us. And so Jesus does this. He calls them. They're having this massive party. And the scribes are looking at it going like, what in the world's going on?
Imagine they come up, knock on the door.
Yeah.
That's the way I see it. Anyway, they come in and they're like, why are you eating? They ask the disciples, why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners? And before they even get a chance to answer, it's almost like Jesus just jumps in and is like, I'm going to tell you why.
Yep.
And what does he say?
Yep. He says, those who are well have no need of a physician, but for those who are sick, I came not to call the righteous, but to call the sinners. All right, John, this is your chance.
My chance.
This is your chance. Like, we almost need like an air horn sound for when we hit this moment.
Man.
Like a burr, 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 burr.
Put me on
this
the spot.
is when like, what is Jesus calling to? What makes him say this in this way? Well, and you might have to borrow from other gospel accounts to get there. Today.
That's why I was going to do. I was going to go back to Matthew's gospel. So Matthew accounting this of his own turning.
Probably a good like let's go with the first person testimony on this story here for this text.
Right. So the quote is almost the same, but Matthew adds in a quote from the book of Hosea. But he says, "Those who are well have no need for a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what it means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I've come not to call the righteous, but sinners." So he's telling these Pharisees and scribes of the Pharisees, the ones who are supposed to be keepers of the law, the ones who know it backwards and forwards, you missed it. Like, you missed the interpretation of what I was saying. Go back and look at what it means that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And he takes that out of Hosea. I got to get there now.
It's Hosea 6.
Yeah, Hosea 6:6.
Which, while you're getting there, I just even like it's crazy. Like we are as I'm prepping for this week's text. Yeah. just recognizing the connection between that statement and where we're going when we talk about fasting and Sabbath.
Yeah.
Jesus is like, what does he desire? Not sacrifice, but mercy.
Yeah.
And it's like, so even these things that can become so spiritual, we can do them in such a way that we're not actually seeking Jesus.
Right.
And like, that's right. Where these following texts are going from here.
Yeah. And I think what we need to realize is like, I don't think like, I feel like they have good intentions. Like they're trying to uphold the law. They're trying to do what they think it says. But Jesus is also saying, hey, no, you've misinterpreted what I said. You missed it. And so he takes him back to Hosea 6, where it says, for I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. And when he says here, steadfast love, that's the Hebrew word hesed, which is covenant loyalty, the kind of love that sticks even when a person fails.
Yeah.
And so like we have a picture here of somebody who walked away.
Yeah.
They failed. But Jesus says, I'm about that steadfast love. I'm about that covenant loyalty to my people.
Yeah.
And I will call them regardless of what their past is like.
Yeah. Which really puts things in perspective. When you think through the sacrificial system, it can seem so tedious and it can seem so, it's really kind of the proper interpretation of it. It shows us our need for God's redemption. And then when you put a word like mercy on there, you're like, well, the reality is that it's going to take God not only holding up his end of the deal, but ours. And that's his love for us. And all that Jesus desires is people that want to come sit at his feet. Yeah. So again, it just puts the walking in faith in perspective.
Right.
That it's not simply trying to earn God's love, but rather just living as if you already have it. And so, it's a beautiful picture. I mean, I always enjoy preaching on Sundays. Well, I enjoy preaching on Sundays most of the time. I say that to be truthful, but I will say this was one of those Sundays where it was like, we can just worship through this text because we all need it. And man, like, I just hope even now, just as I was saying on Sunday, names start to pop into our mind of people that maybe even we've thought are too far gone for God to reach them, and realize that if God can reach Levi, he can reach them too. That's how good the gospel is. And there's no action that they can do that will disqualify them from God's love. Simply all that they have to do is respond to the call to follow him. Yeah. It's good stuff, man. Yeah. Well, thank you again for tuning into the Ascend Bible Church podcast. We're going to keep going through Matthew here. We got some special Mark. See, this is when it's tough because you got Matthew's who we're talking about. Mark's the text that we're
flipping back and forth between.
We're going to keep going through Mark. And then we've also got some special episodes coming up here around the corner.
It'll be fun.
Yep. We'll see you guys either at Ascend on Sunday or we'll see you back here listening to the podcast next week.
Later.